police complaints and focus on the other main policing body in British Columbia, which is the RCMP. I'll start off by telling you a little bit about how the RCMP system works, how it might be different from the municipal, the OPCC system, and then I'll have some discussion after that about just generally how police complaints work, some of the larger kind of concepts of how police regulate themselves and how they set their own policies, and then we'll talk a little bit about maybe what the future looks like and what kind of changes might be on the horizon. If I start speaking really fast, just please let me know. I usually have like a very regulated caffeine intake. And then whenever I come to a conference, it's just like, I can't stop myself. So I think I've drunk like 10 cups of coffee and my heart is like about to explode. So I'll start off by giving you a little bit of background on the legal structure of the RCMP. Now, the RCMP, of course, is one of the oldest institutions in Canada. I myself grew up in the United States mostly, and whenever I tell people in the United States that I worked doing police-related complaints and regulation of police complaints, and that some of those complaints were against the RCMP, everyone, of course, is surprised to find that the RCMP is an actual real policing agency and not just like a caricature in cartoons. But it is that long, long history and that deep connection to colonialism, which has obviously been a hot topic in terms of what place the RCMP has in our modern society and policing. Certainly provincially in British Columbia, the history of the RCMP and the actions of the RCMP have a significant impact on how they're viewed today and the interactions that they have on people today. So I can't actually see my presentation on the little guy. So I'm probably going to have to peer over a little bit, but mostly, I'll just keep talking. The RCMP is like the OPCC, which is a provincially regulated body. The RCMP is a federal body, so it's created by a federal statute. The RCMP actually predates that federal statute. The RCMP Act was created to kind of formally bring the RCMP into the current regulatory existence. Of course, there was a period of time where the RCMP just acted as an arm of the federal government without that type of regulation. Modern RCMP is regulated by the RCMP Act, which sets basically the kind of legal framework for how the RCMP operates. While the RCMP is a federal policing agency, they enter into contracts with provincial governments and local governments to do provincial policing. So rather than having a provincial police force, we have the RCMP acting. So interestingly, the jurisdiction of the RCMP isn't actually bound to Canada. It is one of those agencies that has an international presence as well. So there are sections of the RCMP that operate outside of Canada, whereas of course local policing departments cannot do that. The RCMP is also run by a federal commissioner. This is a picture of our current commissioner. I believe it's Brenda Lickey. And the RCMP has a kind of like structured system where each province has their own commissioner, each detachment has their own kind of local head, and then obviously there's individual officers. So for the purposes of police complaints, the most important thing to know is that the local police department is responsible for investigating their own complaints. So if a police officer, an RCMP officer, engages in an action which is questionably misconduct or a complaint is filed against them, it's typically their direct superior officer who's responsible for investigating. And what I'm going to tell you a little bit about is what your options are in that process. So this is an incredibly boring and complicated graph. What it basically tells you is that the police investigate themselves, and much like the OPCC, there is a regulatory body that oversees that. So it's probably far too small to read. But basically what it said is that when you make a complaint against an RCMP officer, either the RCMP investigates and then you're satisfied with the conclusion and it's done, or if you're not satisfied, you can then file a complaint or kind of a review with the civilian body who's responsible for overseeing complaints. That's called the Civilian Review and Complaints Commissioner for the RCMP, or the CRCC. The CRCC is very, very similar to the OPCC, but there are some very fundamental differences. One of the biggest differences is where the Office of the Police Complaint Commissioner The only real role that they have, or the power that they have to take the investigation completely out of the hands of the police, is to give it to a retired judge for review. The CRCC has a little bit more power in that they can actually conduct their own full investigation themselves. For many, many years, there's been conversation about whether or not the OPCC should have that power too. But the CRCC is an example of an organization that does have the ability to actually take the investigation completely out of the police's hands and come up with their own conclusion. So some notable differences in terms of the RCMP versus the municipal complaint department that might matter to you when you're thinking about if you have a client that's had a complaint against the RCMP. The RCMP operates on what's called the Code of Conduct. So the RCMP Act creates the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is very, very similar to what it says in our Police Act in terms of what misconduct is, but it's not as specific. So the code, for example, does not specifically mention wrongful arrest or detention being misconduct. It doesn't specifically talk about damage to property or deceit. It kind of lumps everything together under this nebulous definition of what's called discreditable conduct. So if you can prove that an officer has engaged in discreditable conduct, then they might be disciplined for that. And that's really what the complaint process brings you, is discipline. I put up a little mystery grab bag because what does discreditable conduct mean? Well, obviously it means everything and nothing at the same time. And probably one of the most important things I'll tell you about this talk is about not necessarily what the statute says, but who gets to decide what these definitions mean. Who gets to decide when something is discreditable conduct, when somebody has engaged in excessive force, these type of terminology that we often hear about with police complaints. Who gets to make those decisions? For the most part, and the RCMP is no exception, typically it's police departments that are going to be responsible for trying to create those definitions and setting those standards. Often, for the most part, when you're dealing with police complaints, successful police complaints typically only come when someone has really deviated from the training that they received as a police officer or the policy and standards of that police department. When there's kind of like a marked departure for what's the normal expectation of a police department, that's usually when you'll start to see a police department say, yes, we find that to be discreditable conduct or excessive force. One of the most common types of police complaints that you'll get against the police department is when somebody has been injured or wrongfully arrested by a police officer. If they believe that they've been excessively injured by a police officer during arrest, then they can file a complaint. I wanted to show you this little wheel. This is kind of what officers often rely on to designate or to kind of train themselves and when it's appropriate to use certain types of force. And it might be a little bit surprising to see this and find out how structured it is and how regimented it is. And in many ways, defining when force can be used and when it's appropriate use of force is very much the real power that police departments often have, is to set these standards themselves. So hopefully you can read some of that, but really what it shows is that there's kind of an increasing amount of force in response to behavior of an individual. This is how the police necessarily view it. So you have officer presence being the lowest amount. That's the blue little section there. As somebody starts to move from cooperative to resistant, then police are taught that they have a greater level of force, like using physical control, soft use of force. That goes up to hard, and then what they call intermediate weapons. So intermediate weapons may mean something like a police dog. It might mean a baton. It might mean a beanbag gun. What the police designate as less than lethal uses of force. And then you'll see in that little section up at the top, that little red area is what the police call lethal force. That would be typically the use of a firearm. And the standard for that use is when there's objectively a belief that an individual is about to cause grievous bodily harm or death. That's really the only time when a police officer, by their own training, is supposed to be using lethal force. Now, one of the great questions the last 10 years of the policing is whether or not some of the other things that a police officer does is actually really a non-lethal use of force. If you remember the Braidwood inquiry with Robert Jacansky, a huge part of that conversation was whether or not a taser is more like a firearm for the purposes of lethal force, and it could lead to lethal force, or whether or not it remains an intermediate weapon. And you can see from this graph that if it's something is classified as an intermediate weapon, then it can be used all the way down to whether or not someone is simply resistant. They don't have to be assaultive. They don't have to be, a fear of grievous bodily harm or death. As long as they are resisting in some way, then sometimes those intermediate weapons can be used. I previously worked at Pivot Legal Society working on police complaints and police misconduct. One of the main things we focused on was the use of police dogs. And what we found was one of the reasons why police dogs were being so heavily used in British Columbia was because they were classified as an intermediate weapon. And that qualified their use just when somebody was being resistant. So let's say if the police believe someone is trying to run away from them, then that justifies the use of a police dog, even if that police dog may cause significant injury that is pretty close to lethal use of force. So again, when you analyze this system, you also have to ask yourself, well, who gets to decide whether or not somebody is being resistant? What does resistant mean? Well, that is probably one of the biggest issues of the police complaint process, and also one of the areas where advocates can have the most influence. So when an individual files a police complaint, you'll often find there's going to be a difference in the two sides of a story. Someone might be saying that they were arrested by a police officer and they were not resisting arrest, but the police officer said they were and used force against them. The police officer might say that they were resisting arrest and that justified the use of force. So one of the ways that legal advocates can help and they can provide support for people when they engage in the police complaint process is to help them basically state the facts or focus their facts in a way that gives them the greatest chance of kind of telling their story and focusing on the things that matter the most. If an advocate can help an individual with the facts of their case, then there's a greater chance that when viewed against the story of the police officer, it may be more credible, it may be believed, it might be more detailed to the point where ultimately the person who's reviewing the file makes the determination that the complainant is being more credible than the officer. Other ways that advocates can really be a huge help in that process too is kind of grounding those submissions in what the available policies or guidelines of a police department are. So every police department has a shocking amount of policies that govern the way that they interact with the public, from specifically how handcuffs can be used in what circumstance, in the jail setting, if somebody's incarcerated, when they can be transferred to one place and how that transfer is to be placed. Sometimes a minutia of detail of how police officers are supposed to conduct themselves when dealing with somebody in the public. And often those policies can actually be quite helpful to somebody if they have a complaint against the police, because if they can show that the police officer acted in a way that was in violation of their own department's policies, there's a much greater chance that they'll win that kind of test of whether or not a police officer was being unreasonable or whether or not their conduct was discreditable. So if you have the ability to find your local police department's policies, some departments post them online. The Vancouver Police Department typically has a copy of their policy manual accessible on their website. Some other agencies do, and the RCMP does have some available as well. If you can find a relevant policy that talks about your situation, then you can try to frame it, or you can talk about your client's facts in that context, and it has a much greater likelihood of being accepted as a complaint. Another way advocates can really make a difference is helping them with the actual process themselves and being present for an interview with an investigating officer. So one thing I will say that is really good about the police complaint process is that it is relatively simple to engage with. Filing a police complaint is typically a relatively easy process. The OVCC's office has many different ways where you can engage. The RCMP typically is more online based, but you don't actually have to provide a lot of detail for a police complaint to be accepted and investigated. One of the kind of positive things is typically if you even have a general sense of what happened, a general time, a general place, often a police department will be able to identify the officers involved and figure out the circumstances, because there is such a high degree of reporting when it comes to policing. Every single interaction a police has with the public, to some degree, is supposed to be reported and notes are supposed to be taken. So it's often, or it's quite rare, that you'll file a police complaint and they're not able to identify who's ultimately responsible. So The other thing that I can say that advocates, I think, can make the biggest difference on is if someone has filed a police complaint and gotten a negative decision, and often you'll find that's actually the time when someone might come to you for help. They might have already filed a complaint, it was investigated, they got a negative decision. An advocate can really support and help in helping them file that review process to the CRCC or to the OPCC and trying to say, I disagree with this decision. I would like it to be either independently investigated or a review process taken place. The realist in me has to say one of the things you probably always want to do with a client is temper their expectations. If you look at the statistics of successful police complaints, they are relatively few and far between. At the end of the day, what often happens is a battle of credibility between the complainant and a police officer. The police complaint system by nature is fundamentally designed so that if there is any doubt, if there's kind of any question of who is being honest or who is the most credible, the benefit of the doubt will go to the police department and to the police officer. While that's never kind of enshrined in legislation or statute, it is most certainly true in practice. I mean, I guess I'm saying that as an opinion, but from my experience engaging with these complaint processes, they really kind of have to be set up that way, because if in the benefit of the doubt was given to the complainant, you'd see a lot more misconduct complaints upheld. That would have a significant change in how our policing structure works. And ultimately, you know, a lot of these institutions, the CRCC, the OPCC, they're all done within the last 15 years. This is a significantly new kind of concept, civilian oversight to policing. When you look at the entire history of policing in Canada, for a vast majority of the time that institutions have existed in policing, there has been no independent oversight. There's been no ability to question whether or not a finding of a police officer as misconduct is correct or not. So it's kind of a gradual process to introduce these kind of layers of oversight and independence. One of the things that the police are probably the most fiercely dependent about is making sure that they still have the ability to decide the kind of fundamental questions in a police complaint. Who's the most credible, whether or not conduct constitutes excessive force or misconduct. Those are the type of things that rarely a police department will hand over to an outside agency. So when you think about that question of credibility and the issue of whether or not, you know, an incident happens, who's the most reliable, it's for that reason, of course, why body cameras have become a very, very popular and kind of modern invention to try to wade into that and ultimately provide some independent third-party evidence of what happens when a police officer interacts with somebody and whether or not that interaction leads to misconduct. So certainly body cameras can sometimes provide that impartial account and kind of create the factual matrix which is necessary in a complaint. But there's a couple things you need to remember about body cameras, which are important. One is that obviously comes from the officer's perspective. A body camera is mounted on a police officer. And there's lots of kind of examples already of when a third party's video, so somebody who's, you know, completely separate, but might have videotaped something on their phone, offers a completely different impression of the most kind of recent and profound example of that would be the death of George Floyd in the United States. There were actually body cameras that were running and operational at that time. From the police officer's perspective, that perspective actually kind of backed up what the police officers were saying. It was the fact that there were independent people, there were third parties there who were, you know, removed from the situation, who took videotape, that actually provided the most compelling account and really brought into question whether or not the police officer's account was accurate. The other really big question about body cameras is ultimately who controls that information. So, you know, I think when body cameras were first introduced, they were seen as this really, really progressive tool that was going to be an accountability tool and nothing else. The reality is, especially if you pair body cameras with some of the other new advents of technology like facial recognition technology, a body camera mounted on a police officer can also be a gigantic tool for gathering information and using that information. And it's for that reason why a lot of marginalized communities have actually said that they're not really huge proponents of body cameras. They're not really big fans because if body cameras are just collecting information on that community and that information is used against them, that's actually a step in the wrong direction. So that's something to consider. in my opinion, body cameras, if implemented correctly, would be a huge benefit and make a big difference in the police complaint process, especially. But the most important question is who controls that information. To be done properly, you'd probably have to set it up so that the information that's taken from body cameras is either stored independently or there's really tight controls or access on how police departments can use information from body cameras. Again, what we've seen from police departments is that giving up that level of control over their own information is often a hard thing to convince them to do. So currently, we actually have a pretty significant process that's unfolding with how the Police Act may be reformed. The province engaged in something called the Special Committee on Reforming the Police Act, and just recently in April this year, published its report and made recommendations on how things should change. Some of the major things that came out of it, one is the call for a provincial police force. So merging all of the police departments in BC into one provincial police force, much like the Ontario police, provincial police, with some kind of local police boards or some type of local kind of input and oversight, but a provincial based body. More training, which is almost always called for when it comes to policing. And I'll talk in a minute about why there's some serious limitations for whether or not that makes a difference. Collecting and reporting race-based demographic data. So this is obviously a big question that's been happening. We know that there's been instances of racial profiling. We know that the police engage in processes like street checks or carding, as it's called in Toronto. But often police departments don't actually track that information. They don't keep the data that shows that it predominantly hits a certain demographic or part of society. So one of the great recommendations of this reform is that the police departments be mandated. They have to collect that data. And the biggest one is that they actually establish a single independent civilian-led oversight agency for all complaints. So if this happens, and it's very possible that it might happen in the next year or two, the Office of the Police Complaint Commissioner would kind of merge with the CRCC, and we'd have an independent body that's responsible for all complaints on police departments. Now, while there's a call here for an independent civilian-led oversight agency, the reforms didn't necessarily specifically say that they should have the ability or the power to investigate police complaints. There's still a fundamental question of who would conduct the investigation and whether or not the oversight would be civilian, or whether or not we'd actually have a civilian agency who's responsible for investigating the police complaints. In my opinion, that would be a much kind of bolder, stronger initiative and move, but obviously brings with it a lot of fundamental questions. So the pros and cons of a question of local, provincial, you hear this talked about policing right now, Rot, and one of the recommendations there, this idea of a provincial police force. Well, what are the pros and cons? So one of the great pros of a local police force, of course, is it can be more catered to the local needs. So a lot of the most progressive police policies have actually been kind of facilitated by local police forces being willing to engage in those policies. So it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal now. But at one point, when the Vancouver Police Department decided that they were going to deprioritize arrests and criminal prosecutions for possession of controlled substances, you know, that was something that they were able to do because they were a local police department and they had the ability to carve that out. There's questions about whether or not a provincial police force would do that. And we see that with the RCMP, because the RCMP is responsible for policing in British Columbia as well as Nova Scotia. You know, it's hard to get a policy in place in the RCMP that actually specifically caters to what needs to happen in British Columbia. One of the great reasons why a provincial force might be a good thing, though, you might have heard there was an election that happened most recently. The Vancouver Police Department played a significant role in that election. And what we have found is that when local police departments are connected to politics, we start to kind of blur the lines of what the role of a police department is and who's in control of a police department and what a police department does. So this is like a little snippet from the Vancouver Police Department's website. If you search for kind of the press releases that they have put out relating to random attacks, you can see from the months of October, September, August of this year, leading up to the municipal election, and I'm sure probably all of us anecdotally remember this if you're looking at the news, there seems to be stories after story after story coming out about the increase or the rise of random attacks. So one of the things about police departments, of course, is that they have a huge level of control over their own information. So every single day, police departments have officers on the street engaging with people, arresting people, and it really is their choice what stories to tell to the public about what's happening in policing. And what we saw in the last 2 months is local police departments wanting to tell a specific story about a specific type of crime that was happening. And certainly there are some, I would say, that there's a political motivation in that. One of the great things that came from the George Floyd incident in the United States was the defunding of the police movement. Local governments have been talking about defunding police or trying to focus resources away from policing because of some of the negative outcomes of policing. This is really the police fighting back. This is their way of asserting their political power, their level of control, and saying we can control the narrative. And if we can control the narrative, then we might be able to influence local government. So one of the main arguments for why having a local police department could be potentially problematic. In a democracy, having a local police department that's so directly engaged in local politics brings up a whole host of questions about ultimately who's the civilian, who's in control. Is the city in control of its own police department, or is the police department in control of who is the city government? So the Vancouver experience wasn't necessarily replicated everywhere. In Victoria, we had a significant increase in media attention in relation to the exact same thing, but it didn't produce necessarily the same political result. So that's a bit of a tricky question, but ultimately, it does fundamentally talk about how you want police to engage in politics. So I'll turn it over to questions in 1 sec. I want to take it back to the wheel. I just love this wheel so much. When I first found this wheel, I couldn't believe it. It was like this secret code for how police officers make decisions, and why they keep talking in the same way that they do, and why they say that this happened because of this. It makes you understand a lot more why police language is the way that it is. So one thing I want to say is that one of the toughest things, I guess, to change when we talk about accountability and how policing works is the way that the police train themselves and the way that the police tell each other what's appropriate conduct and what isn't. Again, that definition of misconduct. But it is possible. So I guess to leave on a bit of a note to show how things can change and how kind of police complaints and policy can develop over time. Prior to Robert Jacansky, the use of a taser was that intermediate weapon. It was that orange area. And that's why tasers were predominantly used in situations where someone was resisting arrest. After the Robert Jacansky inquiry, after that kind of introspective and use of tasers, what we saw was tasers being brought up to that red level and being classified as the type of force that can only be used if there's a threat of grievous bodily harm or death. Now, some would say, if we wanted to have the single most impact on how policing is done in North America, it shouldn't just be tasers that are brought up that way. It's pretty much every type of heavy use of force should really only be confined to the most extreme situations. Arguably, if there's a reason why policing in North America tends to result in a higher level of use of force than in other jurisdictions, it's because of this wheel. And I guess the question that I want to leave with is, who gets to control what the wheel is and who gets to control where that lies? We have a patchwork system of oversight and policing. We also have a provincial body called the Director of Police Services, which is responsible for policing policy. Most of the time, if you engage in the police complaint process or litigation and you bring it in front of a judge or an adjudicator, and they're presented with this question and it lines up with this wheel, then they will ultimately agree with the police department. And we still have a system where the police get to decide where those lines are drawn. Taking that power away and actually making it so that's truly civilian and the local government or the municipal or provincial government gets to decide where those lines are drawn would be one of the most kind of systematic changes we can have to policing. Probably one of the most difficult changes that's out there to make. But I do want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. And I think that's all I had to cover. So thank you all.